Okay, we are now recording.
All right, thanks, Lauren, and thanks for bearing with us, everyone, as we work through a few tech issues. It's always a little interesting. So hi, thanks for joining us. I'm Margot Conahan, ACRL's Manager of Professional Development. We appreciate you being with us today for another webinar offered as part of our COVID-19 and Academic Librarianship webcast series. Our goal for these webinars is to bring our colleagues together to discuss ways to best meet the needs of the library community during these uncertain times. We really appreciate you being with us today. Today's session is being recorded. We will email out the link to the webcast shortly after today's session. The recording will also be posted online. We'll include the webinar slides and the chat transcript as well when we send out the recording materials. We will also share a brief evaluation so you can provide feedback on today's session, as well as share other topics that are percolating so we can respond with new webinars or resources. Today's webcast is advocating for library workers during uncertain times. I'd like to introduce Cinthya Ippoliti, who will moderate today's session and start things off by introducing our presenters. Cynthia, whenever you're ready.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you to ACRL for working with us for this panel, which I think addresses some very important issues that we are most likely all of us grappling with. And so just to give everyone a very quick overview of what to expect today, I will introduce all of the panelists, and each one of them will provide a very brief set of speaking points in terms of their own experiences regarding some of the issues that we're going to be addressing. And then we have 3 pre-prepared questions that they will also address. And then we will make sure to have enough time at the end to take all of the questions that you will have as well. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce everyone. So we have Devin Savage, who is the Dean of Libraries at the Illinois Institute of Technology in Chicago. He has worked in libraries for over 25 years in a variety of roles. We have Kristin Henrich, who is the Associate Dean at the University of Idaho Libraries, where she also serves as the Head of User and Research Services. In 2016, Kristin developed the Making, Innovating, and Learning Laboratory, which is a makerspace and low-risk collaboration learning environment. We have Cynthia Simpson, who is new in her role as Director of Library Services at Madonna University, which is a private liberal arts university in southeastern Michigan. And she's also working towards an EDD in Leadership and Innovation. And we have Gary White, who is the Senior Associate Dean for Research and Academic Services at the University of Maryland Libraries. In his position, he oversees all research, teaching, and access services and is responsible for all public facilities and subject branch libraries. So I'm going to go ahead and advance slides for each of the speakers. So we are going to go ahead and get started. And once again, these are the folks that are on the panel today. And I do want to make sure that I also mention that ACRL and IMLS have additional funding opportunities for libraries who are dealing with COVID-related challenges. And I wanted to make sure that everyone had those links available to find more information on these funding opportunities. So now I will go ahead and turn it over to Devin. Thank you.
All right, hey everyone, I'm Devin Savage. I've had some internet connectivity issues, so if I get bumped, please go on to the next person. I'll rejoin you in just a second. Yeah, just to introduce myself really quick, I'm a new dean. I started on March 1st here at Illinois Institute of Technology. Not a great time to start as a new dean, but I am maybe unfortunately kind of experienced. I've been both in the terms of been in libraries for since fall of 1992 when I started as a work study student. I worked for many years as a paraprofessional and librarian and now in administration, but also in terms of dealing with the need for budget advocacy and budget cuts. I'd say 4 times in the last 5-6 years, I've had serious conversations about the reduction in library budget or staffing. Most notably, a couple of years ago, the university brought in consultants to restructure staffing at the university, and they initially, said that we had far too many let me try and get the closed caption here. We had far too many librarians, but after my response, we actually were then not a target for reduction or restructuring. I want to take a moment to acknowledge that we're at a very difficult time. There's a lot that's happening beyond our control, and there are choices that library administrators just are not sometimes given. And as an administrator, I'm also feeling kind of the pressure from both sides of trying to make sure the library is considered essential, but also making sure that I do everything I can to protect the safety and well-being of my staff. I'm hearing that people are feeling afraid and depressed and anxious, and particularly about funding and about furloughs and layoffs. But I would encourage everyone at every level for us all to work together to preserve and restore the capacity that libraries provide. My viewpoint has always been that the value we provide, the potential that academic libraries hold is inextricable from the people that we employ. It's not about the money that we spend, although we endeavor to spend judiciously in the pursuit of preserving and making available the knowledge of the world and supporting student success through our spaces, furniture, and technology. But for me, it's about our people, library expertise, and our philosophical values to be both a steward of knowledge and an unconditional ally to students, faculty, and community. And on the next slide, I'd just like to make a couple of general observations before we go in and talk about some of the questions. But I think it's careful to consider, whose job it is to really care about the library, it's our job to understand and to align with the rest of the university and senior administration on the campus. Their job is really to lead. Their job is to really try to think very strategically, and no one else knows what we can do and what we're capable of. Also, on the next slide, I would say that we'd also see that some previous models are not going to be as useful in terms of arguments that we've made, particularly with peer benchmarking. We've done a lot in library assessment with peer benchmarking, and that's, I think, not going to resonate as well as will not arguments about status. And also, of course, I think, as usual, trying to be unpleasant or obfuscating during this time would not be something that we could, is going to serve us well. I would also say, our best outreach and our best advocacy is also about building relationships, partnerships that really are productive and help build trust and get people to think of us when they have questions are really some of the best way that we can develop champions. And I think that being opportunistic is really important. I've worked hard to be prepared when I get the chance to educate faculty administration. I think faculty are a good champion for us when we can really speak to them about their research and teaching mission and how we really can help. And I think it's going to be important for all of us to be opportunistic about creating the narrative about libraries being part of the recovery with universities, because this will be a hard year, but I think we want to build and make sure we are part of that recovery. All right, thank you. I will pass it on to who's next. I think that's Kristin.
Great, thank you.
Let me unmute myself here. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, we can.
Awesome. Thanks, Devin. As Cynthia mentioned, I'm Kristin Henrich. I'm the Associate Dean at the University of Idaho. We're a land-grant institution, R2 Carnegie classification, about 11,000 FTE. We have a new university president last year who is an alumni, but also a non-academic and an accountant. So he balanced the books, and we dealt with a 17% budget cut last year, which the silver lining was that we got some experience in talking about budget cuts with our new president and really dialing into his communication preferences. So on the next slide, I just want to breeze through some of the things that we did to address that 17% cut.
the first thing was making the decision right away to value people over resources. For us, this was just flat out the right thing to do. And we also felt that it was good for business and defensible in terms of, you know, it's easier to turn databases back on than it is to recover from years of losing people and low morale. We did use some of that peer benchmarking to inform our reporting and spreadsheets. We pay quite a bit more proportionally for resources than our peers, and we proposed breaking up our Elsevier big deal, which was supported and approved. So we had a lot of existing groundwork that made that possible. We have really strong relationships on our campus. It's not a large campus, which helps. We're also pretty notorious for seating as many university committees with librarians as possible, including the kind of university level budget committees. And again, just that informal relationship building and kind of recruiting allies for the library is so useful and important. We also reinvested in and promoted resource sharing to address some of our journal and database cuts, and we proactively held back several positions, which is why most of us now are wearing multiple hats, which I'm sure you all are at your institutions too. At every step of this process, we really focused on communication, so openly communicating internally with library employees at every level, and open communication with university administration. Just let me pause here. Cynthia, do you need me to stop while we figure out closed captioning?
No, I think we're okay. Thank you. We're going to figure out a way to get the transcript from the conversation. It looks like the computer is picking up my sound, but not anybody else's. So we'll figure this part out. Thank you.
Okay. All right. So that's kind of how we dealt with that huge cut last year. On the next slide, a couple things we're thinking about for this year. Our biggest lesson from last year was be proactive. Be proactive in researching, developing, and communicating your plans, both internally and externally. Don't wait for university leadership to come up with a plan for the library. They are not experts, and in our experience, because libraries fall in that gap sometimes between student services and the academic side, it really requires extra advocacy and being prepared. On the next slide, I'm sorry, just kidding, that same slide. Thanks. So some of the things we're talking about for this year, we're facing additional budget cuts from 3 to 10%. We're still valuing people over resources, although this is a lot harder now that we are such a lean organization. We're hoping to make further cuts to databases and journals, and we're going to be relying heavily on employee agility and teamwork. So one example is we're not buying books anymore because we have no money. So the person that usually processes our monographs has expressed an interest in being retrained to address some of the increased demand in resource sharing. I do want to say that, you know, advocating for library workers doesn't just mean making sure people keep their jobs. It also means that making sure people's jobs are sustainable. Libraries have been asked to do more with less for as long as I've been in the profession. So any discussion about consolidating or reassigning has to be paired with strategic plans that discuss what services, processes, or programs can be discontinued or modified. Otherwise, this is just a recipe for burnout and failure. Okay, and next slide. Thank you. So what can you do? We really felt empowered by doing our research, looking at our peers. As Devin mentioned, that may not be as useful in the coming years as everyone is facing similar situations. Taking a look at contracts and usage data, seeing if there's any deadwood that can be cut, and also talking to your state and regional neighbors. So everyone is going through this to some degree. It goes back to relationship building. I think I'm fairly new to being an associate dean, and one of the things that has struck me is how lonely it can feel sometimes, and I think budget decisions especially can feel really lonely. So making sure that you have a network that supports you and that you have peers you can talk to as you're making these decisions and figuring out how to advocate for your workers. Be prepared. So knowing your audience, who are the decision makers, do some opposition research on them, figure out what their deciding language is, what are their communication preferences. For example, our president is super data driven, but make it fun. So we always go to him with spreadsheets and a couple of really specific talking points related to his top priority, which is student success. And also think about what counter arguments could be presented and how you might address those. One thing our university is talking about is moving to a new budget model called Resource Center Management. And one of the first questions that we were asked was, well, if this is based on enrollment, how does the library fit in? So being prepared and kind of knowing what direction your university is going and thinking through some of the questions that could come up about the library's role. And then finally, just be proactive, contingency plan, communicate effectively and proactively, communicate with as many people as you can, be prepared to pivot if you need to. And then finally, just close the loop and make sure to communicate with library employees. I think it's really easy with budget stuff to focus on external stakeholders and university administration or state boards. And employees really need to feel protected and invested in library budget plans. I think library employees are some of our biggest advocates across campus and in the community. And so making sure to communicate effectively with them is imperative. And that's all I have. Thanks so much.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to turn it over to Cynthia Simpson.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to speak with you today about my experience and things that have happened at my university. As previously mentioned, I'm a director at Madonna University of our library, and I'm new to the institution. I've been there for approximately 6 months prior to having our university shift to a virtual model for COVID. And I'm also a new director, so new at the institution, new in the position, very large learning curve. This has been both an advantage and a disadvantage. It's been an advantage because I've been allowed a more objective viewpoint that has been unclouded by politics and human relationships. But this has also been a disadvantage because I don't know the politics and the alliances, who the untouchables are, who I can talk to, where my support group is at the institution. So it's been a learning curve, but was getting comfortable as things really started to look like they were going to shift very quickly into a digital landscape. And I think that our transition there went fairly well. Madonna University is a Felician Franciscan-based institution, and that means that one of their pillars is respect and dignity for all people, and that has played a large role in how the university has handled personnel and operation decisions in recent months. We have about 3,000 students. We're a fairly lean organization, and there's a relatively flat organizational chart. So it is easy to access people who are in positions to make decisions that can affect you, your employees, and your department. We've had tremendous change in personnel and in operations in our library in the last few years. They have really looked at the department, what we were offering, and how the money was being spent. And prior to my arrival, many changes were made. I was left with a team of 7 including myself. And that included myself as a librarian, another full-time reference librarian, a part-time librarian, and 4 library assistants. I had some general talking points as far as advocating when cuts are necessary. Because I'm from a small, private, tuition-driven university, we don't have a large endowment to pull from. And in our situation, cuts for staffing were mandatory, they were necessary. So when advocating, when you know cuts are coming and when they're necessary for your institution, how do you best manage that situation? I think it's important to consider your needs and not your wants. They're very different in this type of situation. You do need to keep in mind your integrity and your trust to keep that intact, because it will make it easier to continue to advocate for your staff as the discussion continues. Be honest with yourself, your expectations, and your boss. Again, that goes back to keeping your integrity and your trust intact. Don't ask why, I felt was a good bit of advice. It's best to ask how in this kind of situation, because when you ask how, it allows you to open a discussion and clear any misunderstandings or disagreements before decisions are made. If you ask why cuts are coming instead of maybe how they will impact your department, it opens the door for a frank discussion, and those misunderstandings and disagreements can be cleared before your department is negatively impacted because somebody didn't understand how those cuts were going to affect your department. You do want to consider several things when having these discussions. One would be issues or alliances that are part of the institution. And again, being new, Devin mentioned this also, being very new in a position, you may not know where those alliances lie. But again, he also mentioned always be cultivating your relationships and try to establish those as early as possible, so you know who's in your corner and can help you advocate for what you need. You also need to keep in mind what your supervisor's needs are, because when you help them look good, they help you get what you need. And that's a much easier conversation if you are on the same page. No library pun intended. You also want to consider what your supervisor's communication style is. If they're very data-driven and you're not providing them with granular detail as to what's going on in your department, you're going to have a lot of miscommunication. Or if they want just the facts and you're very detail-oriented, they might stop listening to you, and that's not good either. And this is the point where you want to bring in things like logos, so your data and reasoned arguments, ethos, your principles, policies. And if you're asking somebody to make a decision that goes against common policies or principles at your university, you need to come into that conversation with justification as to why that decision is necessary. And then pathos is where you're dealing with emotions and loyalty, and can you appeal in your discussion with administration for the common good for your employees. Try to visually communicate as much as possible. Research proves that people remember visual information far longer than they would remember something in text, and their eyes will land on it first and stay there longer. So it may be more impactful than having an oral discussion or providing something that's written out in text. And incrementalization is another factor to remember, and that's leading your administration through a discussion step by step, rather than a start and a finish type thing where you're expecting them to take one big leap with you. Having those smaller steps where you can build your argument, get a lot of yeses as you go along, will make that whole discussion easier. I also wanted to mention advocacy after furlough, because in a smaller institution, that is definitely likely to happen more than at a larger institution perhaps. And when you're furloughed, it means that your employees are still employed by the university. So there does need to be aftercare involved. And what does that look like? You want to stay in contact with your team, reach out often, find out how they're doing, find out how you can help, make them aware of local assistance programs if that looks like it might be necessary, and make it proactive without waiting for somebody to come and ask you for help. Encourage employees to talk with each other and keep that team feeling going, and help your employer to offer unemployment assistance and mental health benefits, to offer those as well going forward. I have more points, but I'll yield the floor to Gary. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Hi, hi everyone. It's really great to be here. I'm Gary White. I'm the Senior Associate Dean for Research and Academic Services at the University of Maryland. First of all, I want to say thank you to the other panelists. And as I was listening, it occurred to me that their advice is really relevant across all kinds of institutions. So pretty much everything I've heard so far applies to me at a large research university. All of the other panelists are from other types of institutions. So a little bit about the University of Maryland at College Park. We're the largest university in the DC metro area. We're a Research One university with about 4,400 faculty, 41,000 students on campus. About 10,000 of those are graduate students. The library itself is currently ranked 44th in the ARL rankings. We have a budget of about 28 million with 140 professional staff, 71 staff members, and about 200 student assistants. And our student assistants are equivalent to about 67 full-time employees. So we have a pretty robust student workforce. A little bit of background, we also have a new Dean of Libraries, Adrienne Lim, who came to us from the University of Oregon this past year. So she's experiencing many of the same issues that we've heard from the other new administrators on the panel. One of the things she started right away was a new strategic planning process, which included the development of a new mission and vision statement and core values. And we have finished that part of the process before this COVID-19 situation occurred. So we were really able to tap into that work, and it really helped us to guide our planning and thinking in terms of response to the situation. So that's one additional piece of advice is really look to your strategic plan, look to your core mission values, your core values, your mission and vision statements, and use that as a framework to help guide your response. So for us, our new core values and language in our mission and vision talks about equity, democratization, accessibility, very people-focused, and so really we kind of took those as key points to help guide our response. And as we communicated our response to campus administration, we were sure to focus on those attributes. A little bit, I'll try not to repeat too much what was already said, because much of what has already been discussed applies to a research university as well. So in terms of the response, and you go ahead and go to the next slide. We do have a website on our that really outlines all of our everything we're doing to respond, and this is a public-facing webpage that you're looking at. So initially we were planning for skeleton staffing, knowing that we were likely to be scaling down operations, and we focused primarily on those core functions such as interlibrary loan and course reserves and teaching. And so we did a lot of planning around that. And we had I have to give accolades to our fantastic staff, and I'm sure the others would agree. They just jumped right in and were just wonderful in making this happen. So I want to thank and acknowledge the staffs of both my library and many other libraries. We found out in mid-March that the governor was going to only allow essential employees to be on site, and so that no library employees would be allowed on campus. So we immediately moved under a total remote work environment. We also went, for our campus, we also went under severe research restrictions, and that's important because one of the first things the campus wants to do is try to resume research activities, and so that as we plan for possible partial reopening, that's going to be something we're going to have to look at in terms of support. So we quickly moved to the remote work and really trying to think of all categories of our employees. So we've talked about staff, and we also, our librarians have faculty status, so that impacts how we can do budgeting, et cetera. But another part of the workforce that has not been mentioned yet that I feel is very important to acknowledge is that of our student workforce. I just mentioned that we rely very heavily, and we have a very large student workforce. So we were very concerned about when we initially went to total remote work, what would happen to those employees. We did not want to negatively impact them financially when so much other stress was going on in their lives. So we decided to continue paying all of our student employees through the end of the semester. We did that partially because we had already budgeted for the workforce, and we have not yet received any concrete budget reduction figures or targets from the campus. So we decided to keep paying them. Some chose not to continue their work, but most did, and we moved them all to remote projects, etc. We've had no layoffs or furloughs at this time. We're still waiting to hear definite news. And we're also going to continue paying at least a portion of our students through the summer so that we can maintain a workforce, and we'll be better situated as we think when and if we partially reopen, hopefully probably in the fall. So in terms of our library services, our top priorities were to quickly put things in place to assist with online teaching. As with everybody else, many of our faculty were not accustomed to teaching online. And so quickly moving that to an online environment. And for our own staff and librarians, this meant, for one example, we needed to train many of our librarians how to teach in an online environment as well. So many of the courses that were course-related instruction sessions that were planned had to move online. So we did some in-house training for that. We also developed a new COVID-19 resource guide, which is the next slide. This is really a campus, this is an outward-facing research guide just on the topic of COVID-19 to help our campus researchers and others in terms of finding information about it. In terms of collections, we're prioritizing materials for course reserves and interlibrary loan. We're also very grateful for the publishers and the Hathi Trust opening up their content. Our state system has just announced this week that they plan on resuming some activities in the fall. The scope and scale are yet to be determined. So in preparation for that, as with many others, we are doing some scenario planning right now. And we've also developed a document of budget reduction principles that we've put in place, and we've communicated with campus administration that will help guide any cuts that we will almost certainly have to make. In terms of one other point about staff, I agree this is a very stressful and anxious-filled time for our staff members. In addition to just general anxiety about the situation and the state in general, people are worrying about their jobs and health, etc. So I think it's important to communicate regularly and often with staff, let them know what's happening, convey information as soon as you are able. So in our institution, our dean has set up weekly all faculty staff meetings, and she conveys all the information personally, answers questions, and it does go quite a ways toward helping, I believe, to help alleviate anxiety and just the unknown. Another thing that I think is important during this time, and this might be something that's kind of falling off the radar, is it's important to continue to acknowledge and reward the work of our staffs, and just to, as I mentioned, many of them have jumped in and have done tremendous work at a very anxious time of their lives. So we all need to take a moment to acknowledge the work that's been done. So I'll stop there, and then we can talk some more about some of the advocacy efforts that we're doing on my campus as part of the questions.
Thank you. So we have 3 pre-prepared questions that each of the panelists can address and take just a couple of minutes to address, and then we will open it up for any additional questions participants may have. So I'll go ahead and start asking the first question. And a lot of this has already been addressed, but maybe if there's anything you would like to add that you did not get a chance to address during your talking points, that would be great. So what is the best approach to advocate strategically, perhaps versus tactically, and what is a good way to make budget-related decisions? And so I'll go ahead and open it up, and if we want to have each of the panelists provide a quick answer, that would be great.
Sure, I can jump in first. So One thing I would say about advocating versus tactically versus strategically, I think we have to be unafraid to talk about consequences. There's not a lot of us that are in a place to do more with less, which is often kind of a first option given to us. But I think we need to kind of get and understand of like, you know, the various options that they might be coming to us for cutting budgets and figuring out how we get there. I very much agree with Kristin that, you know, putting people over various operational aspects of our expenditures, and especially right now, collections. I think collections right now are something that I think a lot of our stakeholders will understand if we have to subscribe to less electronic resources to some extent. We also unbundled our Elsevier deal recently, and I think a few years ago that would have created, you know, a hue and cry upon campus. But losing access to that, I think people kind of understood what we were doing. The other thing I wanted to say, somebody mentioned earlier in the chat about using the students to advocate for the library. And I think that that's true. Administration often listens to students and they listen to faculty, but getting students to advocate for the library can be a little bit of a dangerous game, especially if you're trying to show the pain. You need to be careful about that, because like if we cut hours, if we are very clear with students about how the library is not being funded, that can hurt retention, that can hurt students, you know, students kind of feeling welcomed and supported by the library and by campus. And that can drive down everybody's resources to some extent. And even worse, it can create a real combative relationship with senior administration if you're not careful about it. So I would be very careful strategically when you work with students for advocacy.
Great. Do any of the other three panelists want to address anything related to this first question?
I just have one thought. This is Kristin Henrich. If you have any tactics that you've been waiting to deploy until it was strategically advantageous, now is a good time. One example, we recently moved to, 3 years ago, we moved to 24/5 staffing, and we really don't have the resources to continue doing that. And so that's one of the things that if we wanted to continue doing it strategically, it might not make sense to cut it, but since we already were kind of thinking about discontinuing this or adjusting our hours, this gives us kind of a good way to cover for that while also still kind of advancing our plans all along.
I'll also jump in. This is Gary. I think strategically we are emphasizing some of the points we've mentioned: communications, outreach, and partnerships. So I think we've worked very closely with our division of IT, for example, and with our Teaching and Learning Transformation Center, and just making sure that we are included with campus communications that come out from these broad other units. They're helping us to let the campus community know how the library is contributing. One example is we lent out our laptops from our classrooms and from our lending program. We gave those to campus so that they could lend those out to students in need. And so we've been able to leverage kind of that positive communication on campus. And just, I guess a broad statement would be, I think strategically, this is a very, I think at my institution, the library administration really feels this is the perfect time to be sharing information and advocating, because you know, all of us are constantly combating the perception that everything is online, libraries are not needed, et cetera. And so if we're not careful, I think libraries could be very marginalized in this conversation. And so I think it's very important for us to really demonstrate how we are directly supporting teaching, research, learning on our campuses through all of our activities, many of which are continuations of what we normally do. But there is the perception that with our physical locations being closed or diminished, that the library is not playing an active role in the response to this on campus. And so I think it's just important to really even step up the advocacy and communication efforts even more than we normally do.
Great, thank you. So we're going to go ahead and move on to question number 2.
I'm sorry, Cynthia, could I make a quick comment?
Please, go ahead.
I believe I'm having some difficulty with my audio. This is also Cynthia responding in conjunction with what Gary said. And we've had a lot of impact from COVID on our campus. We've had a lot of deaths, actually. We're right outside of the Detroit metro area where COVID has been particularly hard hitting. And I've been able to take this opportunity, if you will, because we are in a position where we are reevaluating how we can hone the library into a campus gem and make it a tool by which we can increase retention or recruitment and things of that nature. How are we going to reevaluate and reform what our library is? Right now we have a lot of traditional library things. Most of our collection is in print. A lot of it isn't used anymore. So it's a good opportunity for me to have those strategic conversations to migrate a lot of this to a digital platform. And I had another point and now I've forgotten it, but well, I'll come back to it. I'll yield the floor to the second question. Thank you.
Sure, great, thank you. What are the best advocacy tactics when working with campus administration? Again, I think a lot of this has already been addressed, but maybe anything else that you think is important to share in this regard?
I can, this is Gary, I'll go ahead and start. I think there's a couple of, I think, important tactics that we are using that I think are important. One is we have developed an activity report. So we're gathering all kinds of data and statistics on our use, everything from email, chat questions, virtual instruction sessions, web pages that are being used, our LibGuides that are being used, number of interlibrary loan, course reserves, things that are requested and filled, number of research consultations requested, database usage, downloads, etc. And so I think as many others, we're seeing a big uptick in our chat and email and virtual support kinds of questions. And so we're developing all of that into a written activity report that we're sharing with campus administration and with all of the other academic colleges. And so that's actually putting it in front of people. And we've gotten a lot of good acknowledgement from other campus leaders acknowledging and thanking us for our work from doing that. Another important, and that's a very data-driven way of trying to show our value. Another aspect of this is more qualitative. So we're gathering, so I think many of us are getting lots of individual emails to our librarians and staff thanking us or acknowledging our work during this time. So we're gathering all of those positive comments and negative, obviously we're dealing with the negatives, but we're gathering lots of positive comments and testimonials. We're also actively soliciting those. So for example, we've gotten testimonials from the faculty members on our Senate Library Committee. So we're gathering all of these personal stories that are showing the impact of the library and how we're able to support the teaching and research activities that are going on in this remote environment. So those are a couple of tactics I think are proving useful for us at Maryland.
Yeah, I would echo Gary's comments about making sure that you use whatever faculty governance body that exists on your campus. I think it's important to really try to partner with them in whatever way possible, whether that's if you have a library committee and you're able to communicate to the overall Senate or faculty body through that, or if you're able to serve on committees with them, or if, or other things, but really bringing when we first started talking about having cuts, major cuts to the collections at my institution, I was able to kind of turn a conversation with the library committee into a conversation with our faculty council, into then a presentation to all administration and all faculty on kind of the difficulties of scholarly communication, and particularly in an institution that is STEM focused, but rather austere in our budgets. And that bore a lot of fruit for us. That really went a long ways. I think another thing that I want to kind of call out here is being, there are good ways to demonstrate, ROI with e-resources. I think on the ARL Assess listserv, Colleen Mullally had a really good sort of like rundown of pulling those numbers and giving those numbers during this time. And I think that, I think Josephina said earlier in this chat that, digital resources are really important right now. We've really valued buying ebooks and e-textbooks right now because I didn't want to give any faculty or students a compelling reason to reopen the library before it was safe. So there is, to balance my earlier arguments about cutting collections, I think there is, very tactical decisions you want to make. But in terms of the advocacy when working with campus administration, I think also being really considering all the variables and kind of the big picture when you're doing that homework about your benchmark. Because when the consultants came to us and told us we had too many librarians, I went and questioned their assumptions. Went and said, well, why are these groups our peers? None of them have law schools, and law schools have their own libraries, and you're lumping that in with our expenditures. There are ways that you can kind of unravel the thread. You don't just have to let things happen to you all the time, but it does require sometimes being very thinking a more big picture about the assumptions that are implicit with what you're given.
Great. Kristin or Cynthia, anything you would like to add for the second question?
I think what he just said, this is Cynthia, is very important because not everybody who is on the team to make decisions about your library and your department come from a library background. So they might have a very different focus of what those changes need to look like without having full and comprehensive understanding of how the department works on a daily basis or how it actually services your students. So trying to be as detail oriented as possible to pick apart that narrative and represent it so it does make sense, so they do get the full picture of what you're actually working with and trying to accomplish for campus. Thank you.
This is Kristin. Just to echo what's already been said, I think questioning assumptions and being prepared to educate in a diplomatic way. We've had similar conversations that, start with journal cuts and inflation costs, and then we're able to pivot to, well, here's the conversation about scholarly communication, and did you know about, open access? And so I think being ready to do that in all aspects of librarianship and what our libraries provide is really useful.
Great, thank you. So the final question is, how do you make a compelling case for library administration when perhaps, especially in some instances, library administration is not completely on board with perhaps some of the other things that are going on?
This is Gary. I can start as a library administrator. So I think, I think part of what makes a compelling case that administration is looking for in terms of this is really, first of all, you need to look at your overall priorities for your organization. And for most of us, or if not all of us, it's the people that work there as a priority. So I think in terms of, thinking about pending budget cuts and scale backs, really you have to decide what your priorities are. For us, it's our personnel, and for collections, frankly, we really want to try to preserve our collections. One way to do this is really to engage in some scenario planning, which I think many institutions are already doing. Another way is to really look across the library at and determine what are lower priority kinds of activities and functions, and see where there might be some potential budget savings there. I think it's important to convey your priorities to staff and be very frank with them about the situation. It's very dire in some places, and there are furloughs and layoffs in some places. And so I think it's very important to communicate what's happening, and also that, you know, we try to communicate that that the staff are a priority, and we're going to do the best we can to preserve and minimize the impact on our staff. So right now, for example, we are prioritizing looking at other areas of our operations and identifying those in terms of where we're going to look first to budget savings. So we're looking at things like travel, professional development, our institutional memberships and the associated costs with those, supplies budgets. We are putting all of our renovation plans on hold. So we're really trying to convey to our staff that we're trying to identify as many of those operational kind of cost savings or slowdowns that we can do. And that brings to mind another point is we're really looking at if we can slow down certain operations rather than outright cutting. So looking across our libraries and our work and what might be easier to slow down rather than keep at either full operations or cut completely. And again, all of this is up in the air depending on how long campus is closed and how long, and if we may be experiencing a partial reopening. But again, I think the scenario planning really helps in this area as well. And it gives, and if you can share these, you know, we're doing scenario planning and we're sharing with the entire library for comment and feedback. And so I think, again, that sort of participation in the process is very important for staff.
Maybe we'll have time for one more quick comment about this particular question, because I want to make sure that we do get to any other questions that folks might have.
Cynthia, this is Cynthia, and I can make a quick comment here. Because we are a smaller private institution with a pretty tight financial picture, we have already had furloughs at our institution. And I think, as Gary said, it's really important to communicate to your staff and let them know that they're valued and appreciated. And it goes back to our Franciscan value of treating everybody with dignity and respect. And so prior to announcing furloughs, our president took a 10% pay cut, and our deans, cabinet, and vice presidents took an 8% pay cut. Prior to this, though, I forgot to mention that all of our staff have been paid to work at home for over 7 weeks, regardless or not of whether their position could actually translate to a work at home position. For example, if your job is maintenance and to cut grass, you can't really do that from home, but they were paid full salary anyway. Most of our employees on campus were recently furloughed to a part-time 3 out of 5 days position. And we had a very small percentage of our employees who were actually furloughed without pay, but they were eligible for unemployment and walked through that process. Healthcare premiums are being paid by our university to make sure that our employees stay healthy during this time. And we were given a date by which we expect new decisions to be made. So we know what the full picture is. We know where our campus administration is heading. And we know that we're not the only ones seeing cuts and impacts on our salary.
Wonderful, thank you. And I saw some questions on chat coming regarding how are you supporting student employees? So maybe this is a question more directly related to Gary, and have folks expressed concern about coming back to campus? I don't know if anybody wants to address sort of those two parts, and then I'll keep an eye on chat to see what additional questions come up. Thank you.
Well, I can address a little bit about student employees. We have 60-some student employees, and that, you know, we closed whatever, March 12th, I think. And so we had a real concern about what to do with our student employees, a lot of whom, or almost all of whom, were federal work study. And so after talking a little bit with HR, we gave them a survey to offer them, you know, 3 options. One, you know, if you're not coming back to campus or you're not planning to work anymore, let us know. Only a couple students took that. There was a lot of work for like sort of campus life and housing students if they're going to remain on campus. There were a lot more bodies that were needed to help like, deliver meals and such. And we said they could, if they wanted to, they could take that for like sort of a guaranteed full student job if they wanted, and only a couple took that. And the last option that we gave was giving them all like a few hours. We would guarantee them a few hours a week, like maybe up to 4, and we would find things they could do at home, whether that was like small, small metadata projects or a lot of training that we needed because we were moving to a new discovery system. And so we just kind of ran out the school year offering them like 4 hours a week, and they almost all took that and were very grateful for it. So that was something we did. For the summer, I think we're not going to be able to hire any students. We might be able to keep 1 or 2, but we're just not going to have any student employees. And we haven't heard anything yet about students coming back to campus. By and large, I don't know if this is our student body, but they have seemed less concerned about in-person activities than staff or faculty have.
I'll jump in also. This is Gary. One tactic that we used was about a week or 2 before we were closed, we developed a Google spreadsheet where we asked people from throughout the libraries to submit possible projects that students could work on during this time. And we have also been able, incidentally, to use that for staff who have jobs that are more dealing directly with physical materials or with the facilities. So we were able to develop a pretty robust list of activities that people could do, students could do, and some of them our staff are doing as well. Lots of different kinds of things, everything from updating web pages, creating new web guides, training manuals, lots of professional development and training activities as well, as Devin mentioned. So that was very helpful for us because we didn't really have to scramble, and we did not have to justify keeping employees or keeping students. We were able to give them concrete work to do that is actually benefiting departments and people from throughout the libraries.
Great. Go ahead.
This is Kristin. I'm just going to jump in to pop in a link to the chat that we used to develop some work for our student workers. We were able to get everybody on work from home through the end of the semester, which we felt really good about. A lot of our specific library work was through digital initiatives. They are working on a project digitizing some of the student newspapers from the 1918 flu, and so our students were able to work on that, which we felt really good about. And this kind of ties into another question that came into the chat about supporting mental health for employees and library workers. We were really concerned with students being able to continue earning an income and pay their rent. They were expressing a lot of concern about that. What we found is that once we started working with the students, a lot of them had really variable capacity for doing extra work, adjusting to different home circumstances, classes going online, sharing computers, sharing laptops, being displaced. So it was really important to us to kind of check in with students and do a lot more, trying to think of a diplomatic way to say hand-holding, but just kind of working with them a little bit more closely than we would normally to make sure that we were doing everything we could for them. And doing something similar for our library employees. So, okay, what are your working hours? You don't have to work on the weekends. You can still feel free to take leave if you need to. And just acknowledging that this is a lot for everybody. And there's a lot of uncertainty, which is really hard to work through. And so meeting people where they are and letting them know that they can speak up if they have a need or a problem, and giving them opportunities, low risk opportunities to do that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I know we are pretty much out of time. I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to Margot, and we are happy to keep the conversation going. Everyone's email addresses are listed in the slides. And thank you all so much for taking the time to be here. Thank you to our panelists. And again, thank you to ACRL. And I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen now.
Great. Thanks, Cynthia. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. And thank you for to our panelists for sharing their time, their ideas, their resources. We really appreciate everyone being with us. We will share out the recording as well as the PowerPoint shortly. So keep an eye out in your email for that, and we'll also post it online. So again, just everyone, thank you for joining us. We appreciate you being with us.